Sound plays an important role when it comes to editing a fight scene. Depending on your choice of music and sound design, you can set the tone of the scene from something that feels frightening and dangerous, to gritty and realistic, to lighthearted and comical. There's a wide range of choices you need to consider when planning your sound editing strategy for any action scene. They should all really be decided on up front and be largely based on the type of movie you're working on and the context of the particular fight within the film. When approaching a fight scene, you'll have some decisions to make before you even start editing. First, you need to decide on the overall tone. Next, you'll need to decide on the overall style. First, let's look at tone. So, what's the tone of your fight scene? The tone refers to the general mood and atmosphere in which the fight takes place. Is it serious, like something from the Rocky films?
Come on, Tom.
Is it frightening and dangerous, like something from A History of Violence?
Or is it comical, like something from Happy Gilmore? Or maybe it's fun, like something from Pirates of the Caribbean. The tone of your fight will affect your sound editing process as well as your music choices, so it should all typically be decided on up front before you begin the actual editing. Things like music selections, types of sound effects, and sound editing techniques will all be affected by this choice. Next, you need to think about the style of your scene. Style is different from the tone. Does your fight scene aspire to be very realistic and natural, with real-world sound effects and minimal editorial trickery? Or will your fight scene use more stylized techniques like slow motion, mid-fight flashbacks, and heavy sound design? Stylized and flashy scenes will typically require a bit more in the way of advanced sound editing techniques to really get right. We'll discuss a lot of these later in the course. And we obviously can't talk about sound editing without discussing sound effects. There are two primary uses of sound effects in a fight scene. The first is to provide realism and texture to an otherwise sterile or bland world. Typically, we'll use Foley sounds to accomplish this. We expect to hear things like feet scuffling on the pavement, clothes being rustled and grabbed, and even human sounds like grunts. These types of sounds all help to add to the idea that what the viewer is watching is real, and the events are actually happening right before their eyes. The second and perhaps more obvious function of sound effects in a fight scene is to add impact to the various hits and other assorted fight moves. Since the actors aren't actually punching and kicking each other, you'll need to use sound effects to give it a realistic feel. Sounds simple, right? Well, let me tell you from experience that it's surprisingly easy to go wrong with this and end up with something that feels cheesy and slapstick like a cartoon, or even empty and boring like nothing's actually happening in a fight. This is where knowing the style and the tone of your scene is really going to help guide you when making these creative choices about adding your sound to the fight. The tone's going to guide you in picking sound effects that will feel appropriate to the atmosphere and to the theme of your fight. Sound effects you'll need for any fight scene include a variety of punches, kicks, body hits, slaps, falls, and sometimes even bone breaks. You'll also need to make sure that you have a decent selection of sound design elements to sweeten the hits. Now, by sound design, I'm talking about things like swishes, suckbacks, and bassy hits. And there's a lot more that we can talk about later. Let me show you the difference between using a punch sound effect by itself versus layering in a few bits of sound design to really build it up. Now, keep in mind, you won't always want to do this. It totally depends on the style of the fight that you're cutting. If you're aiming for a hyper-realistic scene that's meant to feel like you're almost there and actually watching the person in the fight, a more minimal and true-to-life sound bed is probably the way to go. But if you're cutting on a big action film, where everything is meant to feel over the top and really intense, layering in a few extra sound design elements can really help you add impact to the cut. Alright, so here's a regular punch sound effect. Pretty standard punch sound effect, right? Not too cartoony, and just the right amount of crunchy bone impact and skin-on-skin contact. If your scene is supposed to feel realistic and minimal, just stop here because you're pretty much done. But now, check out what we can do to the same punch with a bit of extra sound designing. That's got a lot more impact, right? This amount of sound design and sweetening would not be appropriate for every punch during a fight, like we said. But it would definitely help to add some impact and intensity to some of the more devastating and powerful punches in a fight. Alright, let's take this a little bit further. What's it like when we add music on top of everything? When it comes to any edited piece, music has the power to instantly and dramatically change the tone and feel of a scene. What you consider a music bed could just be a bunch of atmospheric drones to give the scene a bit more texture and mood, like this. Or it could be a full song with its own rhythm and feel, which will have a direct effect on the pacing of your scene and the timing of your cuts. This brings up an important point when it comes to choosing music. Custom music is great, but expensive. Now, in a perfect world, you'd have a professional composer create a soundtrack to sync up with your edited picture after you've already cut the scene together the way that you like it. This is called scoring. Now, obviously, not all productions have that type of budget, and sometimes it just comes down to being a matter of how much time you have to get something cut together and out the door. Pre-made library music is often sufficient and much cheaper. It's definitely possible to cut together a fight scene with full sound design and music using pre-recorded library cues, which will usually cost a fraction of the price of getting a professional composer to custom make a soundtrack specifically for your fight scene. Music libraries such as High Finesse Music and Sound and Position Music both have extensive libraries of professionally composed music for just about any purpose, including fight scenes. We've provided some of the music and sound effects from these libraries for use during this course. Alright, now let's put it all together and look at a few examples. I want to show you the dramatic difference that sound editing can have on a fight scene. I've got a small section of the fight scene that we're going to be working with here. There's 3 versions. The picture is cut basically the same in each version, but the way that I edited the sound in each is substantially different. Now, in the first version, I've added just enough sound effects to give the clip a bit more texture and presence, just to help the viewer feel like they might actually be there, close to the action as they're watching it. We'll call this version Basic Sound Effects. Take a look. Alright, so that's the first version. Simple and effective, and a totally viable option if that's the effect that you're going for. Now, in the second version, we have the same section of fighting with the same sound effects and Foley that you just heard, but now it also has a couple layers of sound design on top of everything. In this version, we've added things like bassy hits, swooshes, and drones. We'll call this version Basic Sound Effects plus Sound Design. Here we go. Alright, and the third version is again the basic picture and sound effects as the first version, plus sound design, plus music. Take a look. Pretty cool, right? So in all 3 examples, it's the same basic picture cut, but each has a completely different feel just by changing the way that you edit the music and sound. You'll need to be well practiced with these skills and aware of your sound editing options when it comes time for you to cut together your own fight scene. In this lesson, we learned a bunch of sound editing tips that we can use while editing our fight scene. First, we discussed the impact of different tones and styles. Then, we took a look at various types of sound effects and the roles that they play within the context of a fight. Next, we discussed different ways of approaching your music choices. And finally, we looked at a few side-by-side examples of the impact that sound editing can have on a fight scene. Coming up, we're going to start preparing to edit together our fight scene. We'll begin by creating a project and importing the exercise files. See you in a bit.